IEEE Consumer Technology Society. It was formerly called Consumer Electronic Society, CE. Now it is called CT Society. So we actually make sure that the consumer electronic professionals, networking and education, that is our goal. And that we do like locally in the San Francisco Bay Area. So the agenda of the today's meeting is 12 to 12:10. I will introduce the CTSoc-SCV, and then presentation will be done by Stephen Mears of Future Source, and then 12:40 to 1 o'clock will be question and answer and networking. Okay, during today's meeting, if someone wants to, pictures or, via Twitter or things like that, they can do it by those links. Okay, so the 2020 officers and volunteers. So I am the chair, Olga is co-chair, and other people, as you can see, they are different roles of the 2020. Now we come to 2021. Olga will be the chief from 2021, and I will take the co-chair role. And Joseph is the webmaster, and Pat is actually the key position of secretary and treasurer, and Avid will be the vice chair. So we are seeking additional officers and volunteers for 2021 to help with speaker, workshop, social program chair, and additional volunteers. So please send the email to me. Okay. And the next City Society meeting is on 12/7. And the topic is from wearables to cordless kitchen. And NFC delivers the wireless data. And it is done by Mike. It will be spoken by Mike Herman of New Current. So is today a lot of people came or not yet? So how many are IEEE members? Okay.
You can just raise the hand virtually.
Virtually. Okay. So this virtual thing sometimes, is difficult. But anyway, so how many are IEEE CE members? Okay. So the next is that for becoming a CE member, these are the, fees and other thing, IEEE membership, CE Society membership, and then there are some member recruiting awards. So if you want to, you recommend some other person to join, then you will get some of the dollars that you can use towards IEEE. Okay, benefits of becoming a CE-CT member is CE-CT Society magazine, and access the CE-CT Society members only pages and free download articles. And email your suggestion for speakers or topics to me for 2020 and 2021. Send it to Olga. And job opportunities, please raise your hand if your company is hiring, and leave your contact information with me or Olga. And job seekers, if you are looking for a job, please also send an email to myself and Olga. So if somebody is looking for it, so that we can connect you both, job seekers with job available. Speaker introduction is today's speaker is Stephen Mears, and Stephen is a research analyst at Future Source Consulting, and he leads the wearables, mobile, and retail distribution research in consumer electronics team. He joined the team in 2018 after graduating from the University of Warwick. Today's topic is big tech versus healthcare wearables. And in this topic, he will address a lot of marketing challenges, and he will talk about different vendors, what the vendors are doing, and how you kind of classify those vendors. So those are the things he will talk about. So the consumer wearables, as we know, we all use consumer wearables, whether it is iWatch or some other thing, and forefront of quantified self-trains over last several years, and vendors have taken strides in the depth, breadth, and accuracy of the data they feed back to the consumers. With wearable stakeholders like Apple, Fitbit, Google, Garmin, and other smaller ones, all seeking to navigate a complex regulatory environment to leverage the lucrative opportunities in health and wellness. Yeah, some of the people have go through the regulatory, and some people say it is just for entertainment purpose. So those things actually, Stephen will clarify that. So Future Source explores the present state and future outlook of the consumer wearables market before assessing the ambition of these consumer electronics giant and their potential to disrupt the healthcare sector. And thank you for joining the meeting today. Let me go out. Stephen, go ahead.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. There we go. So can you see that all okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. So, yeah, good evening, everybody, and thanks all very much for joining. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the IEEE for hosting me today, and I'd also like to particularly thank Joseph and my colleague Nicola for organising the webinar. This is certainly a topic that I think is very close to my heart, and I'm delighted to really have the opportunity to share some of Future Source's latest and greatest insights with you this evening. So as an introduction, I've been with Future Source now for a little over 2 years, having joined after graduating from university. And in that time, I've really developed a focus on the wearables market, as well as mentioned, the mobile handset and retail distribution kind of markets as well. So the data I'll be sharing with you today comes from our upcoming wearables market report. So it's due to be published next week. And the service has been going for around 8 years. So the data and insights that I'll be sharing have been researched through our industry interviews that we conduct, kind of through each research round, and they're conducted across the spectrum of wearable stakeholders the world over. So I'm here to talk with you all on the topics of wearables in healthcare. So to make it clear up front, I'm primarily coming at this topic from a consumer electronics perspective. I'm not a medical professional, and while I do track some of the more medically specific devices within the wearable space, the core of our wearable service is, of course, the major consumer electronics brands. So with that in mind, in my time tracking the wearables market with Future Source, one of the rapidly emerging trends within the category has been the expansion of the features and use cases that are really designed to bring wearables closer to that medical and healthcare space. Sports and fitness has already become very well entrenched within the industry. So the next wave of growth is really going to come from the health and wellness markets. So to kick things off, I'll start by sharing our latest expectations for the wearables market as a whole, before then breaking down the competitive landscape and talking about what the various vendors are doing. We'll then get into the main topic of the evening, exploring really the opportunity presented by healthcare wearables and looking at the strategies that vendors are trying to apply to really leverage this opportunity. And I'll then wrap things up by looking to the future and highlighting what we think the next generation of wearables will look like and how we'll get there. So our wearables service covers all consumer wrist-worn screens, hearables, and XR headsets. The reason for such a broad coverage is because we ultimately think that these three product categories will really start to converge in the coming years and start to slowly but surely create the post-smartphone mobile platform. Now, I'm not trying to get ahead of myself here and suggesting that it's happening anytime soon, but we think, and this is something that we've had feedback from through our industry research, that this is potentially the long-run outlook for the wearables industry. Now, 2020, it's almost become a bit of a cliche to say it, but 2020 has been something of a chaotic and difficult year. And as a result of that, overall consumer electronics spend is expected to have declined this year. It's not all doom and gloom. with a lot of bright spots emerging. The staycation mentality has really bolstered industries such as headphones, gaming, and TV. And as you can see here, our three wearables categories are all expected to enjoy a marginally growing share of total CE spend this year. And that's due in no small part to the expansive range of use cases that these devices are able to cater to. So as you can see here in that pie chart on the left, in volume terms, the hearables market is really expected to drive a majority of total volumes. If this pie chart were in value terms, it would be a much more closely run contest between hearables and connected watches, largely due to smartwatches present within that segment. But in terms of the expanding installed base of personal IoT ecosystem products, hearables are increasingly likely to be the first point of contact for most consumers. It's worth keeping in mind, however, that this is largely an incidental contact. Most consumers are purchasing hearables simply, or at the very least primarily, for the audio function. Wrist-worn wearable consumers are arguably a touch more discerning, weighing up biometrics, activity tracking, LTE connectivity, and aesthetic before making their purchase decision. It's a much more conscious entrance into the world of personal IoT and the quantified self. Across the board, we're expecting all bar one of the wearable categories that we track to grow. And that decline in activity trackers, while it's slowed down somewhat this year in light of COVID and the growing consumer awareness around the need to be active, it's a category that between now and 2024, we will see decline globally. But this is because consumers are pivoting towards more feature-rich devices, such as sports watches and smartwatches. And something else to highlight here is that while all those other categories are growing, it is all at different rates, and hearables and smartwatches are very much leading the charge as our two more mainstream devices. The expansion of use cases and features across the wearables market is really what's driving this growth. For wrist-worn categories, communication, sports, health, and location-based services such as GPS tracking are all proving very compelling for consumers and are all in one way or another contributing to the robust growth outlook that we see. XR HMDs are still a relatively immature market, but it is increasingly clear that it too stands to benefit from these use cases. Remote working has been forced on many of us by COVID, and the industry sees this as a genuine opportunity moving forward. And that's to say nothing of the fact that XR is already present in some productivity segments as well as some sports products. Hearables are equally exploiting these use cases, with biometric tracking supporting its growth in health and sports, and the emergence of office-based hearables are also really proving to be something of a notable opportunity for the category. So while we're focusing our attention today on the health segment, please do keep in mind that it's one among many verticals driving wearables growth. There's a lot of innovation and a lot of product development happening on in the background that's going to contribute to the long-term success of the category. Of course, health is one of those opportunities that has yet to be fully leveraged and could prove to be incredibly lucrative. So what does the competitive landscape look like? So as we look across the wearable ecosystem of the major consumer electronics vendors, the first point I'd like to highlight to you is the differing levels of integration across each company. Starting with Apple. Now, Apple have built its hardware business by having each unit deeply integrated into the wider iOS ecosystem. Its watch and AirPod products are both interwoven with the iPhone. It is, of course, notable that the Apple Watch is becoming progressively more standalone, with improved features, battery life, and LTE connectivity, all combining to give consumers access to a lot of the features that they would normally rely on their iPhone for. Something that the industry feedback constantly highlights through my research is that the strength of Apple was not really in the individual quality of their products, but rather it comes from the fact that its ecosystem is greater than the sum of its parts. The more involved a consumer is with the Apple ecosystem, the better their experience. It's a perpetuating cycle, and as a result, Apple have created lifelong Apple consumers. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Xiaomi. Now, Xiaomi are a great company who have done tremendously well to disrupt the activity tracker market and undermine Fitbit in their position there. And Xiaomi's smartphone business continues to improve. And that's to say nothing of the fact that they've probably got the broadest portfolio of IoT products of any single vendor that anybody cares to think of. However, unlike Apple, Xiaomi have yet to really drive integration through its product lines. Each IoT device is essentially modular, by which I mean that they can be substituted out without losing any unique Xiaomi user experience. Xiaomi, alongside both Oppo and Vivo, have been described as a China Inc., as the prime members of China Inc., with the connotations of this being that these vendors produce, really good quality and good value hardware that taps into existing mass markets, but really places much less of an emphasis on an overall integrated user experience. Huawei, up until about 6 or 12 months ago, were a part of this group, but the advent of Huawei mobile services, enforced as it has been by the political headwinds that they've faced from the US, has arguably moved them slightly along the spectrum towards the software, services, and content side of the industry. They remain heavily focused on hardware, but I think we may well be at the start of Huawei's journey towards potentially becoming a walled garden vendor. Looking through the remaining vendors on the list, Google's one-size-fits-all approach, which was so successful in the smartphone world, has struggled to generate significant traction in wearables. The acquisition of Fitbit is a strategically interesting move that we'll look at in more depth later, but it's fair to say that Wear OS has so far proven somewhat underwhelming. Nevertheless, the ingredients for success are there, and Google are undoubtedly one to watch as the market heats up. Samsung are, of course, the leading CE vendor globally in volume terms, and they've also been somewhat disappointing within the wearables industry. A lot of the growth that they've seen this year has come from the hearables market, and largely this is because it's seen as an easier product to develop and bring to consumers. Samsung, like Google, have the scale and the ingredients for that success, but they really now just need to go and execute it. Amazon have taken a slightly different approach compared to its peers, and as a vendor that lacks a true smartwatch, it's often at risk of flying under the radar. Nevertheless, they more than warrant their place in our minds, especially on this topic around health wearables. So what Amazon lacks in terms of presence within personal electronics, it more than makes up for in the smart home. And this in itself may well prove to be a gateway into greater personal electronic success in the future. Alexa is, of course, present on the latest Fitbit device, as well as others from vendors such as Huawei, and Amazon has made a point of creating wearables that orbit, but don't quite go toe-to-toe with the smartwatch market. The Echo Ring, Frames, and more recent Halo all point to a wearables strategy from Amazon. And I'll confess, if you'd told me this time last year that a major CE vendor would be acquiring Fitbit, I would have guessed Amazon. That they would have been my first guess as the obvious candidate. It remains to be seen if Google's acquisition kicks Amazon off of Fitbit's products. My money's on yes, I think it will. But Amazon is certainly a vendor that has the potential to drive the wearables market and really innovate in this space if they choose to. So the data shown here is across all of the wearables products that we track. And so that long tail of others is extraordinarily long, containing all the Wear OS devices for wrist-worn wearables, the audio brands for hearables, and the major XR vendors, which granted aren't particularly big, but nevertheless are present within that slice. And as you might expect, Apple are not only the leader of the pack, but they're actually pulling further away. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm not an Apple consumer. You can see I actually use a Garmin watch, and I've not got any Apple shares. And the reason I disclose all of that is because I'm supposed to be an independent analyst, but I always run the risk of sounding partial to Apple whenever I have these conversations. But let there be no doubt, Apple are leading the wearables market, and they currently do remain steps ahead of the competition. The integration of services such as Fitness Plus will really only further support their market position. As we've already touched on, Samsung are struggling within the wrist-worn wearable segment. They are still growing across wearables as a whole, and this, as I've mentioned, is due to hearables, and that's why their arrows somewhat skewed off to the side, because they are struggling in some of the core categories there. Huawei have had a strong 2020 so far, due in large part to the strength of their domestic market, but we do think that we will see Huawei return to some kind of international expansion before too long. And Xiaomi, of course, are currently heavily reliant on its activity tracker business, but they've now joined the smartwatch market, and they, along with Vivo and Oppo, have the potential to actually target the mass market consumer and grow that consumer base, bringing new people to the world of smartwatches. We've already somewhat touched on the use case expansion, so we won't spend too long here. But the main points I want to draw from this is that each major brand is generally reliant on a single key vertical. In the top left of your screen, we've got the major sports watch vendors, with Garmin slightly further along towards that fashion side, given some of its watches are positioned more as lifestyle devices rather than the hardcore sports watches that they also do. In the bottom left, we've got our communication and generalist watches, which are dominated by mobile vendors, and Xiaomi now with their smartwatch are straddling that gap. Fossil and Casio are fashion-oriented brands and are now joined, of course, by Citizen with the release of their smartwatch this week. And Fitbit, Withings, and Amazon all center their wearable strategy around that health and wellness segment. Apple, of course, managed to straddle all four of these segments, proving that it is possible to be all things to all people. So let's move into the health opportunity now for wearable products. And I'm going to start by talking about the health capabilities and landscape for hearables, before then doing the same for wrist-worn wearables. And the reason that I've separated this is because in some ways they do cater to different issues. There is, of course, significant overlap, and as I've hopefully hammered home already, we do view hearables and wrist-worn wearables as two core components of this emerging ecosystem of personal electronic devices. They'll work well in the coming years, and we think that the product proposition that they could create will prove to be incredibly compelling for consumers. The problem with the hearing aids market really is it remains a heavily regulated market, and it's sold exclusively through medical channels through a whole chain of audiologists. And this contributes to a huge average price of around $1,300. It ships around 25 million units a year, generates about 30 billion at retail. So for context, that's about 5% of the entire aftermarket headphones market and around 90% of its value. And you may have come across claims suggesting that the regulation governing the outlets for hearing aids could be changing, giving rise to a separate over-the-counter hearing aid category. It's perhaps been misreported as a relaxation of the rules, but no decision has yet been made, and the regulation around this does remain uncertain. But what this whole conversation has done, and what the hearing correction opportunity has done, is really drawn the attention of consumer electronics and audio brands to the hearing health market. The scale of the hearing loss problem is pretty significant. Around 5% of the population have some sort of hearing loss. Less than 10% of those people actually have a hearing aid. And a large number of these consumers, as you can see, around 200 million, are under the age of 50. This, by the way, is all data taken from the World Health Organization by myself and my headphones colleagues. So there are currently many barriers, including costs and access to such products in developing economies, but the main barrier to the hearing aids market really is the social stigma around wearing them. Hearing correction issues is also a problem which is getting worse, with the World Health Organization suggesting that around 900 million people will have disabling hearing loss by the year 2050, and around 1.1 billion young people under the age of 35 are currently classified as at risk due to overuse of loud music or overexposure to noisy environments. But this is something that our fantastic headphones analysts that we've got here at FutureSource are really looking at, and they're particularly considering the opportunity of this new hybrid grey area between hearing aid and headphone. We see a lot of similarities and interchanges between dedicated hearing aids and hearables in terms of both form factor and technology. Both hearables and hearing aids are wireless devices that are designed to be worn beyond entertainment consumption. And we're already wearing a lot of these devices now fairly constantly. The stigma around wearing them has somewhat been eliminated. You only need to think of really the ubiquitous AirPod or the other true wireless headphones that you might have seen in the various video calls you've been on this year. There's also a movement in the other direction. Hearing aids have adopted audio playback and calling and phone calling features, which would normally sit, we would normally see that reside within the consumer electronics products. And the next generation of Bluetooth LE includes support for hearing aids. So clearly these two industries are converging, and somewhere between personal audio and hearing aid, there's a really strong market opportunity, and some companies already poised to try and capitalize. So when we consider those brands, it's useful to look at this as a kind of spectrum. So on the right-hand side of that gray dividing line, we have our dedicated medical products, those hearing aid companies. And it's important to note that hearables are unlikely to deeply penetrate into this particular market or this particular industry. In fact, our research has suggested that these vendors are generally fairly confident that their position won't be taken. There's still going to be a market for specialist hearing aids and hearing aid companies. But what they are happy with is that these hearable and audio vendors are all spotlighting the issue of hearing health. One of the companies that is trying to blur that line is Nuheara, an Australian company who have been one of the first to have a dedicated hybrid product, which offers hearing augmentation for less than $500. That's a fair chunk of money, but if you consider the $1,300 average sales price of a hearing aid, you can see that it begins to look like very good value for money. In terms of consumer electronics brands, Bose were one of the first to market with their Hearphone neckband, which also retails for around $500 and can help those mild to moderate hearing loss issues. And Bose are by no means the last CE brand that we expect to enter this space. You can see that list along the right-hand side of your screen there. And the entrance of CE brands has only become more likely with the news that Qualcomm and Jacobi have partnered. This partnership means that Qualcomm can now integrate FDA-approved software into their true wireless SoCs. And this will commoditize things like hearing tests and conversation enhancement features and bring that option to all of the many brands that Qualcomm supports. In assessing the wearable healthcare market potential, it's worth first touching on the scale of some of the problems that wearables may be able to solve. And again, the medical data here that I'm quoting is from the World Health Organization and other similar industries and sites, I suppose. So besides the wealth of issues that we've got here, from high blood pressure all the way down to cardiovascular disease and diabetes, there's also the fact that an estimated 54 million people worldwide suffer from dementia. And in the US alone, each case of wandering, i.e. somebody, kind of getting disoriented and losing track of where they are, each incident typically costs emergency services around $16,000. Moreover, around 1 in 4 of us will suffer some form of mental health issue within our lifetimes. And wearables can't necessarily solve the most severe problems associated with all these issues, but they can support at the long tail. So within healthcare wearables, we think that there's a clear gap in that health market that wearables can really come and exploit. And more importantly, there is actually a market in that gap. And this opportunity is defined by 3 key features we see that we explore through the research. So firstly, consumers have become increasingly aware of their health and well-being. This was a trend before COVID, but it's now accelerated. Lockdowns have meant that people have become acutely aware of their activity levels or lack thereof, and wearables can support a generally more active, healthy lifestyle. Sensors are improving somewhat in accuracy and also breadth, but more importantly, the development of this smartwatch hearable ecosystem means that the hearable can do the biometric tracking. It's obviously a lot more, a lot of biometric tracking that happens in the ear is a lot more accurate than that which happens on the wrist, but it can leave the processing burden to the wrist. Taken together, this capability of wearables is expanding to encompass solutions to a wide range of health problems. And the prevalence of CE brands across these categories will mean that these solutions really reach scale quite fast. The road between proof of concept to commodity for these vendors is very short. They're able to really bring something to market and make it scale quite quickly. Of course, there's no shortage of hurdles to overcome. Foremost among these is data privacy concerns. We can have all the regulation in the world with GDPR here in Europe, for example, but consumers are still likely to feel somewhat uneasy with a Google or Amazon device capturing quite intimate health data. Now, the Fitbit brand may shield Google to this from a degree. While sensor accuracy is improving, there does also remain still a significant margin of error that really limits the medical credibility of these products. And this feeds into the FDA regulation point. Regulatory barriers are still present, and there remains a wide delta between medical devices and healthcare and wellness devices. The elephant in the room here is, of course, insurance. Over the last few months, I've had a fair few conversations with insurers who would love to be able to use wearables to gauge the health of their consumers. This is something being explored across the wearables market. Vitality here in the UK offers its clients heavily discounted devices from Apple, Garmin, Polar, and Withings, and the user can upload their activity levels to gain points. And of course, points mean prizes, in this case, a discount on your premiums. Wearables and insurance is a fairly thorny issue that touches on a lot of these barriers that we've highlighted. This is incredibly intimate data we're dealing with. Activity levels is one thing, but sharing things like SpO2 or sleep patterns may make consumers feel a little uneasy. The accuracy of the data and the regulation around its use only muddies the water further. But insurance is one channel that could really help drive adoption, particularly in the market like the US, say, where there's a fairly high level of health insurance penetration. The opportunity to save money through a healthy lifestyle is, I think it's fair to say, a fairly attractive proposition for a fair few people. And there's a reasonable body of evidence that indicates, to a degree at least, that those with an activity tracking device are in fact more active than those without. So this is certainly something that I would suggest the industry explores further. Now, let's consider this health wearables landscape. The first thing, of course, that probably comes to mind when you look at this slide here is that it seems something of a crowded field. Starting on the right-hand side with that grey dividing line, this is by no means, by the way, an exhaustive list of relevant vendors, but it gives you an idea of who's present. Verizon is probably there on the bottom right, one that maybe sticks out a little bit, but of course their recently released Care Watch, designed to support families as they manage the well-being of elderly relatives, means that they're worth including here. And don't be surprised if over the next year or two we see other telco vendors join them. We also have TheoraCare, Life Plus, Omron, and Navigil as brands, all specifically focused on an element of health, be it non-invasive diabetes tracking, heart health, or supporting the aging in place market. That aging in place market, by the way, is really a notable opportunity. This so-called silver tsunami has often been underserved by tech vendors, but there's a lot of potential for vendors to do a lot of good there and make money doing so. This is something I think Joseph and we've spoken about before. So a lot of the vendors that are present on that right-hand side of that map fall under the kind of the telehealth market. And this industry has itself enjoyed pretty good uplift during COVID and stands to benefit from the fact that there's been a growing appreciation of the need for remote patient and remote health monitoring. For these vendors, the wearable hardware they offer is simply a gateway into a wider specialist service. As with the hearing aid market, these vendors are generally confident that their niche is pretty solid and won't easily be captured by the major CE vendors, which will typically have a wider focus. Rather, these specialist vendors are happy that the issues they solve are being spotlighted by bigger companies and that the solutions they offer are, in a sense, being validated by the broader interest from consumer electronics. Looking at our yellow box of CE wearables vendors, we see Withings beginning to again be a company that is maybe blurring that line between a consumer and a medical brand, and Aura have done quite well at establishing its ring as an unobtrusive health tracking device. Neither vendor, however, really has huge scale, so their impact is unfortunately likely to be limited. Fitbit and Apple are really the two leading vendors, at least in the health wearables landscape, and we expect them to potentially push up against that barrier and maybe move the needle. One of my most valued research contacts has pointed out to me just recently, actually, that Apple's family sharing function, which ostensibly turns the watch into a kids tracker, also creates most of the infrastructure needed for a remote health device suitable for seniors. And this is on top, of course, of the biometric tracking that Apple devices are already capable of. Fitbit, of course, is a very strong health and wellness brand, and as we'll touch on in the following few slides, its new subscription services are really a unique attempt to attract and keep consumers within the Fitbit ecosystem. I've also put the sports watch brands present into this graph, not because they're necessarily pursuing health opportunities yet, but because they've got a wealth of knowledge that could easily be flipped into health use cases. Looking at the horizon, it is hard really to see beyond Google and Apple as the two major vendors likely to drive us into towards more health-oriented verticals. Starting with Google, it's clear that their strategy is to rely on the brand and expertise they've acquired in Fitbit. The purchase of Fitbit has a lot of layers to it, which might be too long to go into here. But at the risk of stating the obvious, there is an industry-wide consensus that Google bought Fitbit to access the wealth of data captured by wearables. However, for this strategy to work, Google and Fitbit have to create a wearable that people want to wear. It's no great secret that Wear OS has proven underwhelming. And while Google are perfectly capable of maybe wasting money when they make an acquisition, an investment of $2.1 billion, I think, signifies genuinely renewed commitment to the category from Google. Fitbit is a company that's very capable of creating good hardware. Google certainly has the capacity to create good software. On paper, this should work out well. In the real world, there of course remain some question marks, but being an optimist at heart, I would like to think that Google's renewed focus will help Fitbit compete with its bigger rivals, as well as support the other Wear OS partners that Google has. Added to all of this is Fitbit's own strategy. The Health and Health Plus subscriptions offered by Fitbit are an intriguing indicator of the next steps in wearables. Linking the hardware with a content service that actively responds to activity and biometrics isn't necessarily new. Garmin has on its Connect app has coaching, for example. But the Fitbit spin on this, of course, takes it a lot deeper, and it focuses it a lot more on a healthy lifestyle rather than the pursuit of athletic goals. And while Fitbit has yet to be integrated really in any meaningful way with the wider Google ecosystem, this is something that we think will happen. And as we've already highlighted, an ecosystem play will prove to be a lot more compelling than a discrete single product. I've already waxed fairly lyrical about Apple, so we'll keep this portion concise. But Apple's fully converged ecosystem that they're creating is currently unmatched on the market. And as shown by their Fitness Plus subscription, they're now creating services designed specifically to leverage the watch. Now, the Health Plus name has now been taken, of course, by Fitbit, but a rival Apple service is absolutely on the cards. And we've already touched on they may well be targeting that silver generation by stealth with the family sharing mode and the infrastructure that's created there. So there's a lot of layers there to Apple's health strategy. And we saw them earlier sitting in the middle of those 4 pillars. So they've certainly got the capacity to execute a lot of different plans at once. And the final vendors to talk about here are Garmin and Polar. We touched on them on the previous slide. They both, of course, remain very focused on the sports watch market, but Polar owns an awful lot of intellectual property around biometric tracking, and Garmin, of course, have now acquired Firstbeat. So they've both got significant and sufficient knowledge to pivot into health. This is something that Garmin already somewhat explores through its Garmin Health Conference, for example. And while neither vendor are of a scale with Apple or Google, and they both lack any kind of ecosystem beyond wearables, notwithstanding, of course, cycling, turbos, or bike computers, both brands undoubtedly could find partners or merger opportunities to try and counterbalance their larger rivals. Sorry, I'm aware I'm pushing up against time, so we'll try and get through this final slide fairly sharpish. But I just want to take a moment to really cast our minds forward and consider what the next generation of wearables products look like. And we'll go beyond here. We'll be going beyond just a touch the health opportunity, and we'll also now be considering wearables really in the very broad sense of the market. So across the top, we have our hardware first vendors. Samsung and Xiaomi both have fantastic hardware ecosystems. They've both now developed their own virtual assistants and mobile OSs, but crucially, both vendors lack content and service strategies, relying instead really on Google and other third-party apps to leverage their hardware. Now, that target in the middle, the fully converged ecosystem of devices, content, and services, means that hardware really only gets you halfway. That converged ecosystem is really what we think these vendors across the board of consumer electronics are quite potentially driving towards. We've got Huawei and Apple there, bundled in the top right there, only because of a rough similarity in type. Of course, from a content and services perspective, Apple are ahead of its Chinese rival. But like Samsung and Xiaomi, both vendors have fantastic hardware ecosystems. They've both got their own virtual assistants and mobile OSs. But of course, unlike Samsung and Xiaomi, they do have something of a content and service strategy. For Huawei, that's been forced by Huawei Mobile Services. They now curate their own app store and various other mobile services, but we think this could well be a prelude to a more concerted movement from the vendor towards that walled garden approach. They certainly could match Apple in terms of scale, and they presumably have relatively easy access, I would say, to the likes of Tencent and Alibaba, both content software leviathans. Apple, of course, have their wide range of services and their well-publicized pivot to services to kind of ram home that point there. At the bottom, we've got, I suppose, our software first vendors. And we think these vendors have a stake in the next generation of wearables. Facebook, of course, have significant control of the social media and communication space, and they link this with an entertainment offering. From a wearables perspective, they have the market's leading all-in-one VR headset and the capacity to be a first mover in AR. They've actually recently just partnered with the sunglasses brand Ray-Ban to try and bring some smart glasses to market in 2021. Facebook were also heavily rumored to be in for Fitbit before Google got there, so clearly they do have an interest in the wider personal electronics landscape. Google already have a hugely comprehensive ecosystem, and they need no further introduction really from me. From a wearables perspective, as we've already mentioned, the purchase of Fitbit is a statement of intent from the vendor. They know they've lost ground to Apple in this market, but certainly they're more than capable of bridging that gap if they invest. And though Amazon are yet to make a dent in wearables, at least in the wearables categories that we track here at FutureSource, they're certainly capable of doing so. They're orbiting the mainstream wearables market, and they've got extensive expertise in the smart home. They've done well in entertainment, and it's easy to imagine Amazon Web Services underpinning a wearable service business model. And this says nothing of the fact that Amazon has deep enough pockets to make an acquisition that would really give them a leg up into the mainstream wearables market and help move them towards that fully converged ecosystem we're looking at. That question mark there denotes all the other potentially outside bets. We've already touched on the large Chinese tech companies like Alibaba and Tencent. But of course, smaller wearables companies could well innovate and develop and really try and come through the middle of the pack to put a stake in the ground for that next generation product offering. You know, it's not always the big guys that get there first with the innovation. So to conclude, really, the wearables market is one frontier among many for the key consumer electronics vendors, but it is a market that in the coming years we expect to be fiercely contested. Apple already has a very commanding position, and it's not one they'll relinquish easily. but Google, Samsung, Amazon, all of those types of vendors are capable of moving a market and really posing a genuine challenge. The health opportunity particularly is huge, and it's been under leveraged so far. And CE vendors the world over will be looking for a piece of that market if they can get it. That concludes my presentation for the evening, and I'm happy to now start taking questions. I see some questions there from Joseph. So, yep, I think we're more than happy to make the slide deck available after the webinar. Nicola, my colleague, I assume you can confirm that for me, but yeah, I see no reason why we can't send this around. And there's also a question here on passive earbuds and headphones included in the hearables category. Should it not be a category that's smart headphones in much the same way one defines smart speakers? I think that's a very, very fair point. We take our hearables definition from our headphones colleagues, and really, I think it's in part just to establish the installed base, and it's one that I think we could probably follow up with later on with you. If you'd like to get in touch, and we can actually explore those definitions with the headphones team specifically. But really, it's to emphasize the wider wearable ecosystem. You know, we view these devices as more than just simply headphones, and really kind of driving a slightly separate category there. So, do I see smart glasses like Bose focused on audio linked into the linked into the hearables or separate categories? So that's a question there from Chris. And actually, yeah, we speak to Bose on this very topic, and when we speak to them, we tell them that their Bose frames are hearables when we track them. It's an interesting one because obviously the aesthetic of the glasses and trying to get consumers used to that aesthetic is I think one of the next challenges for that XR. For the XR category, but yes, we track those under the hearable space. But of course, there's the fact that it is an innovative, at least innovative form factor, and we see, I mean, other examples as well with Huawei's partnership with Gentle Monster and a couple of other hybrid glasses that fall under hearables, but again are trying to get consumers used to the form factor. And I've also got a question here from Omar. So in the landscaping chart, why is Google not listed? And I'm trying to think which chart you would be. Would it be the let's have a look. Is it this chart? Sorry, Omar, or would it be the one for hearables?
Hi, Stephen. Can you hear? It's I think before that one.
This one.
More. I was just curious more. It was a pie chart. This
was
one.
It? This one.
Past. Yeah.
So they're within the that 53% with Wear OS. I was specifically just breaking out the brands, and with the
So this is not by operating system.
No, this is not by operating system. No.
Okay. I see. Thanks.
Stephen, one quick question.
Sure.
That about the differentiation between the medical grade wearables versus other wearables. So I understand Apple is quasi medical grade, but I don't know whether that where you kind of satisfy that the Apple is trying to be a kind of giving you that that if you have a heart condition or heart, arrhythmia, that you can do it, or other kind of things. How do you differentiate between those things about real health versus, a kind of a quasi health and entertainment and sports and kind of things like that?
Sure. So I'll be honest, that's a particular issue that I've really wrestled with trying to get my head around. And in the conversations that I have with the people that are, you know, more on the right-hand side there of this chart,
Right. Okay.
they all kind of say that, you know, with the FDA, and firstly, by the way, I'm no legal mind, I'm no regulatory mind, so forgive me if I'm maybe being a bit misleading here. It's entirely inadvertent, but with the FDA, for the true medical grade stuff, it has to be kind of reach level 3 clearance, which, as I understand it, requires at least 1 to 2 years of clinical testing.
Okay.
What Apple have done with their, you know, the cynic in me might say with their very deep pockets, is kind of create a consumer level of FDA clearance, so they can say it's FDA approved, but it still falls under the health and wellness device. It's not clinical in terms of it's not clinically graded, it's consumer graded. So there is still that margin for error. There is the fact that, you know, for every wonderful story of an Apple Watch identifying somebody having a heart attack, there's plenty of others that show they're a false positive. So it's just the fact that there is still that delta between the health and wellness grade accuracy of the sensors and the true clinical medical grade of the sensors.
Thanks. Yeah.
No problem. Do we have any other questions at all?
Anybody has any other questions? You can actually unmute your mic and talk.
I have
Hi,
a
Stephen.
question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Hi there, Stephen.
Thank you. It's been very interesting. With regard to Apple, you just mentioned, does Apple give any kind of statistic as to the percentage of false positives and correct positives on things like the watch identifying heart attack?
You know, I'll be honest, I've never actually looked for that. I imagine that they wouldn't be talking too much about the false positives unless it's fairly low. So it's probably something that we could probably do a quick Google search on to establish. Of course, one thing that I will say about Apple is the various health studies that they conduct with, you know, they obviously have now done the largest heart health study that was through the Series 4 watch with the ECG monitor. And they're, you know, now kind of continuing that and also doing a hearing health one, funnily enough, on the wrist as opposed to through the AirPod, and also a women's health one. So Apple's clearly, you know, seeing that the health potential of its device, and in terms of it being a mass market consumable device that that can really capture a huge amount of data and really kind of support at least the clinical development medically. But in terms of the specific percentages of false positives versus correct catches, yeah, I can't think of anything that I've seen or heard of at all. And
Thank
Joseph, no problem, Stephen. And Joseph has asked about some insights on the industrial use of wearables, so HoloLens by Microsoft and others. Yeah, so this is actually part of our specific XR tracker. And in terms of the productivity use case for XR, this is really the one that we see as potentially driving that side of the industry to the mass market. A lot of the feedback I've had over the research for that category is, you know, that it's quite analogous to the PC or even the BlackBerry, where it started as a productivity device and then started penetrating the kind of the consumer market when people realized that actually there was a productivity benefit to using the products in the first instance, to then the benefit of using these devices in the home. And then the moment it starts reaching that kind of critical mass, you really then get the fantastically creative developers involved who start actually exploiting these platforms for consumer use cases. And I mean, BlackBerry is widely seen as the precursor to the smartphone, and, you know, where they failed was, you know, not tapping into that kind of that consumer space in the same way that Apple and others have done since. But yeah, mainly it's the in terms of the industrial use cases for XR devices, that's really the driver. There's not really a significant kind of proof of concept from a consumer perspective yet. Although, sorry, I'm aware this is a fairly long-winded answer, I will say that there is something of an expectation that if a major CE vendor were to get involved, and by major CE vendor, I do mean Apple or Samsung or any of well, Samsung were kind of already involved, but if somebody actually came in with proper XR glasses, they would do quite well, and they would validate the category. So it's really just who's able to come to market with a good enough product that then attracts the attention of the various ecosystem around it.
Hi, Steven. I just had a quick comment. I think, you know, it was a very interesting topic to start with. And I think the key here will be the data privacy, mostly, you know, how people or consumer, like how us are we okay with, you know, these companies having, or like you said, or health data, right? It's key from them to convince us that our data will be safe. So that would be a challenge.
Absolutely, and I think really a lot of it's to do with perception. I mean, try as we might, the Googles and Facebooks of the world already have a lot of data on us, and you know they're only getting more. And so really, if they're able to, I suppose, execute it well, then you know consumers will probably be, unfortunately, either none the wiser or absolutely fine to sign up to it. But yeah, you're right. If there's the perception that they're really just after the health data and they're not really providing any value in return for that data, then it will fall flat on its face. So unless there's any other questions, I think we are probably just about done now. You've all, I'll just go forward here. You're all more than welcome to contact me kind of offline, and you know come with any further questions or any follow-ups or anything that you know we could potentially carry on the discussion offline. And of course, if there's anything else that I can help with, either you know from a speaking side with IEEE, it's been you know fantastic. So thanks very much for having me. And for anybody else, if you'd like to just take this conversation offline, please do feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to get back to you when I can.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you all very much.